Okay, so I think without further ado, we'll get started. So welcome everyone to the final critical realism group of this reading group of this series. This is the 10th session, and thanks very much all of those who have stuck around to this point. So hopefully we'll have as good discussions as we've had in the preceding sessions. So just while the various presenters are talking, please do store up any questions that you've got, because there'll be lots of time for Q&As afterwards. And if you want to put any in the chat, then that's always helpful to get us, so we get a heads up. But otherwise, feel free to put your hand up and shout out when we come to the Q&A at the end. So I'd like to introduce our main speaker for this evening. It's a great honour that we've got Doug Popora here, who is professor at Drexel University. Over the last 35 years, he's written extensively on social structure. He's written a book on how holocausts happen, on how democratic populations' indifference to US military activity in Central America has enabled that. And that's an indifference that could not be more relevant than now. He's also written a book on the loss of meaning in American life, another one on post-ethical society, Abu Ghraib, the Iraq War, and the moral failure of the secular. But this evening, he's going to talk about his book from 2015, Reconstructing Sociology, which is the critical realist approach. And for many people working in critical realism, this has become a seminal book for understanding how to apply critical realism within sociology. So I'll hand over to you, Doug. Just give me a moment to get your PowerPoint up, and then I'll go quiet and let you continue.
Okay.
One moment.
Thanks so much for that. Oh, wait a minute. I guess I got to share my screen first.
No, I'm going.
Oh, you're doing it. Okay.
Oh.
That's fine. If you want to do it, that's fine.
There you go.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. Well, thank you again. I want to thank you and Priscilla for inviting me. I think it's great that these courses on critical realism have continued. And what I'm going to do is show 7 or so slides detailing myths about social research, and in the end, 7 corresponding commitments that make research different when it's done from a critical realist perspective. So Robbie could go to the next slide. So we start with myth 1, and you see the 2 Carls there, Karl Popper, Karl Hempel, associated with the covering war model. We start with myth 1, that ethnography and historical narrative are only exploratory or descriptive. Ethnography is the kind of case study that anthropologists do, and historical narrative, the kind of storytelling that historians do. From the perspective of the reigning positivist philosophy of science, neither of these modalities, neither in ethnography nor narrative history, are explanatory. Why would positivism think that? I mean, we typically tell stories to explain our behavior. Why was I late to class today? Well, I set my alarm, it didn't go off, whatever. We have a story or a narrative. What we don't have in such narratives, or in the thick descriptions of ethnography, are clear if-then statements leaking events. If this sort of event happens, then that sort of event happens. For positivism, this kind of law-like regularity among events is what causation is about. For positivism, causal explanation actually involves deducing the event to be explained from the law and the occurrence of a prior event, as you see there. Several things to notice about this account of causal explanation, this positivist account. One, for the deduction to work, the law must have a degree of invariance. It must also be general, which requires showing its provenance over many cases, not just one. And that's why positivists dismiss ethnographic case study or narrative as just one unique historical event. For positivism, no regularities, no causation. One other thing to notice about this view of causality, it focuses on events rather than things, which Bhaskar called actualism. The positivist account actually sucks the causal power out of things and relocates it into the event-connecting laws. We critical realists entirely reject this positivist account of causality and instead return to things which have causal powers, whether they are exercised regularly or even just once. So the critical realist view detaches causality from generality, and in this way vindicates attributions of causality, even in single cases, be they ethnographic or in the historical record. With this move, critical realism really establishes a scientific method of ethnography and historical narrative. Next slide, please. So a second positivist commitment brings us to the supposed virtue of value neutrality in research. Positivists hold to a fact-value distinction in which only colorless facts are objective and values are considered subjective. I have time only to puncture this fact-value split with the illustration you see here, which Roy cites in the possibility of naturalism, but which goes back, I believe, to Isaiah Berlin. I love to present this question and these answers to my students because they all take for granted that the right answer is number one. Why? Because our general culture has been pervaded also by the positivist mentality. So one is picked because it is the most free of values. But surely the most completely truthful description about the Holocaust is the one that's most value-laden, and that's statement 3. There's an important lesson here about bias and epistemic objectivity. As Andrew Collier put it so well, to be objective and unbiased is not to be value neutral, but to give the truest account of the object described, which may be inextricably value-laden. Instead of value neutrality, critical realism enjoins intellectual honesty, which means openness to counter evidence. I say epistemic objectivity involves being true to the object described. Well, what does true mean? That brings us to the third myth I want to discuss. Next slide, Rob. Thanks. Remember that Roy coined what he called the epistemic fallacy to capture how in positivism and postmodernism both, ontology gets swallowed up by epistemology. Abandoning any reference to the existence of an ontologically objective reality, the first premise abandoning any reference to an ontologically objective reality, which is the first premise of critical realism, both positivism and postmodernism embrace an epistemic conception of truth. They embrace an epistemic conception of truth. The epistemic conception of truth equates truth with an epistemic state like certainty or consensus, or with a foundationalist methodology that guarantees certainty as an outcome. Positivism believes in foundationalist methods and hence in the possibility of certainty and therefore truth. Postmodernism correctly doubts that any scientific method can guarantee certainty. And so in rejecting foundationalism, postmodernism also comes to disbelieve in any absolute truth and instead embraces relativism. Critical realism rejects both foundationalism and the equation of truth with an epistemic state like certainty or consensus. Because critical realists believe in an objective reality, critical realism adopts an ontological conception of truth. It's ontological as opposed to epistemic conception of truth. With the ontological conception, truth has nothing to do with how certain we are about whether what we say or believe matches the ontologically objective reality. What? Oh, let me say it again. With the ontological conception, truth has nothing to do with how certain we are, but only whether what we say or believe matches the ontologically objective reality. So it's a kind of a correspondence theory that we hold to. How do we know what matches the objective reality? In simple cases, it's by inspection. I think I left my keys in the car. I go and I look and I find them. My hypothesis was true, even though it wasn't certain. So it's not certainty that makes for truth, but the match with reality. Of course, in more difficult cases, we cannot simply inspect. With more difficult matters, critical realism's premise of judgmental rationality holds that even without foundations, we can, in an ad hoc manner, on a case-by-case basis, weigh different arguments and evaluate which is strongest. that strongest argument becomes our best guess as to the truth about reality. Of course, it's important to critical realism that our best guess can be wrong. For critical realism, our truth judgments are fallible. Because in contrast with the epistemic fallacy, critical realism makes reference to an ontologically objective reality. Critical realism can distinguish between our truth judgments and the ontological reality about which they judge. And you may remember that Roy calls this the difference between the transitive and intransitive dimensions. That is our truth judgments and the reality about which they describe. Without this distinction between our truth judgments and the objective reality about which they judge, objective reality changes as we change our talk about it. That's where we're left with by postmodernists and post-structurists who, although they reject truth, can't help but act as if they already have it. Next slide. So everything I've been saying so far has dealt with concepts. Positivism, however, privileges the empirical over the conceptual. And that too is a sensibility that pervades popular consciousness. So when I ask my students which is more amenable to proof, conceptual or empirical questions, they quickly raise their hands on behalf of the empirical. I need to point out to them that nothing empirical can be proven with certainty. It only matters that are mathematical or logical, which are conceptual. To see where we end up in research by sliding the conceptual over the material, consider Durkheim suicide. Durkheim wanted to construct the sociology unreliant on individual action. So to construct society's suicide rate, Durkheim explicitly rejected the ordinary understanding of suicide as intentional self-homicide. Instead, he defined suicide as any act which a person knowingly made his or her own death more probable, even if it was not the person's intention to die. That definition encapsulates an incongruous collection of suicide and other actions besides. So it's like a mixed bag there. Fortunately for Durkheim, his study relied on government statistics, which counted suicides according to the ordinary definition rather than Durkheim's own. Had Durkheim actually managed to count what he himself had defined as suicide, it wouldn't be telling us what the folk understand and care about as suicide, but something rather quite different and of dubious interest to anyone, which we might more clearly dub Durkheimicide. The larger point is that if you don't have your concepts right in the first place, all your subsequent empirical data collection might add up to nothing as sensible. Next slide, please. Durkheim is not the only one to want to do away with human agency. Critical realism is a humanism that upholds the moral center of conscious experience that is usually called the self. Unitary selfhood, however, has long been out of academic fashion. Valorized instead is a post-structuralist anti-humanism. It goes back to Althusser, gets picked up by Foucault and Derrida, and continues through feminist post-structuralism. From the anti-humanist perspective, belief in a continuous unitary self is derided as essentialist. Instead of unitary self, the talk is of multiple subjectivities pervaded by different discourses and subject positions. We are, on this view, instead of a unitary self, a floating melange of different selves. Of course, in terms of content of thought, who we are changes over time. In terms of content, every time I add a new belief, I'm somebody new. From a moral perspective, however, I remain responsible for what my past self has done, not just in the past, but in other circumstances. If I offend you and you later confront me about it, can I say that the guy who confronted you is gone? Why are you bothering me? If I can't say that, then in opposition to post-structuralist anti-humanism, we need to affirm a morally responsible self that remains the same across circumstances and across time. It's another example of why Roy liked to consider critical realism in enlightened common sense. Next slide. At its base, social ontology concerns the basic categories of social being. The broadest ontology on offer is the one Margaret Archer has dubbed SAC, or SAC, which stands for structure, agency, and culture, as three distinct categories of social being. There are continuous moves in the social sciences to reduce these categories by conflation. We're still in, for example, what have been called the cultural and practice terms. The practice term tries to do away with the internal thoughts of individual agents by appeal to cultural routines and practices. The effect is to make the category of agency disappear. More prominently, structure is now collapsed into culture. Margaret Archer again defines culture as intelligibilia, or that which carries social meaning. I think that's essentially what she means. Meaning may reside in texts and other things besides our heads, but it's only to the extent that meaning gets into our heads that it becomes operative. Meaning is thus something subjective, or at least intersubjective. There was a time when social structure was understood not as subjective meaning, but as objective relations among people. Now, in many quarters, social structure has been reconceptualized as rules or schemas. But rules as something meaningful belong to culture. Same with schemas, which are cultural representations of some sort. Thus, to the extent that structure is identified with rules and schemas, it becomes something cultural. It may be true that what we call things is less important than what we bring to analysis, but we have to ask whether things like inequality, competition, and power are important, and what sort of things are they? What are inequality and power, for example? Are they practices? Is inequality a practice? Are they rules? Are they schemas? They seem none of those things. Inequality and power don't seem any of those things. They're instead relations. Competition too. We might think of competition as a behavior, something that people do, but before it's a behavior, it is a situation of conflicting interests that motivates the competitive behavior. If we are being clear in our categories, therefore, relations like power, inequality, and competition cannot be subsumed under culture. They're structural phenomena. Seeing them as such allows us to ask about the causal relations between structure and agency, which becomes harder to do when the categories are collapsed. Next slide. The final myth, which I suppose applies to critical realism itself, is that we can dispense with quantitative methods as the distinct methodology of positivism. It's true that for positivism, statistical equations virtually become our explanations of things. And it's true that critical realism demotes statistics from explanations to evidence for one or another explanation. But in that demoted capacity, quantitative methods should not be dismissed. We may have a question of comparative frequencies, as on this slide. What is the wealth gap between whites and blacks in American society today? It's actually, as you can see, quite large. The question is important, and to answer it, we need to count. And so we need statistics and quantitative methods. As I said before, critical realism is anti-foundationalist, and so it doesn't set up one kind of authoritative methodology. There are no a priori methods that critical realism upholds. Instead, for critical realism, the methods should fit the question asked. Next slide, Rob. All right, to sum up, the 7 myths or problems in social research lead to 7 critical realist solutions or commitments in scholarly research. First, we critical realists don't try to get rid of or downplay human actors. We don't try to downplay human actors as coherent selves who purposely pursue their interests and values from a point of view. We accept that, which is what makes us humanists. Second, critical realism remains alert to structure as well as to culture, taking note of such relations as inequality, power, and competition. Third and fourth, as I just got finished saying, critical realism embraces a mixed methods approach to research with the type of method dependent on the type of question asked. This both intensive and extensive methods are embraced. Fifth, critical realist researchers are not empiricists. We recognize that conceptual matters are every bit as important as empirical. And we don't just work within a paradigm, but openly also question the paradigm in which we work. We further believe in an ontologically objective reality, which we can get right or wrong. Truth is the name we give to getting reality right, and that is our goal. Finally, we don't expect the truth to be value neutral, and so don't abide by that prescription in our research either. Instead, whether addressing either our values or our facts, we strive for intellectual honesty, changing what we believe when the evidence or logic call for it. Last slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you very much, Doug. That was great, and I'm sure everyone. There was a huge amount in there, and all very useful. I was frantically scribbling notes, and I'm sure everyone else was as well. So thank you so much. Do we have any questions? Is there anyone want to start with any questions?
I explained everything so clearly.
You obviously did. We've got one question here. Vani, do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. That was really helpful. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about intellectual honesty, because I think I can imagine that phrase being quite disputed from people from other viewpoints. So yeah, just really like to know a bit more about what you mean about intellectual honesty and your last point 7. Thank you.
So what I mean, first of all, is that for critical realists, we have no problem with somebody coming with a point of view. They do their research because they want to show something and they think this would be a good case to show it, let's say. By intellectual honesty, I mean being ready to change our own beliefs when the evidence doesn't, when the evidence confounds us. When we say, I expected to see X, instead I'm seeing X minus or Y. And so being honest about that, struggling through with it, and maybe changing your original theory. Now, that's easier said than done, because as Kuhn pointed out in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and also Lakatos after him, you can always try to save your theory with some other hypotheses that you put in. And that there may be nothing wrong with that. So it's a judgment call when you have to say, yeah, this pet theory of mine, it really, even with all the adjustments I make to try and account for this contrary evidence, I have to say it's less good than somebody else's theory, which is completely different, and be ready to make that shift. So as I say, it's a judgment call, and it depends on a number of different things, but we have to be open to that. I think we have to be open to those moments because they occur in larger or smaller instances throughout our research. Thanks
very much. We've got a few more questions coming in. I'm just going to read a couple out and then let some other people ask questions. So so from Katie Ormerod, she said, could we say that intellectual honesty is like how critical realism views knowledge as fallible? We know that our knowledge may be wrong, so too can our beliefs be. Yeah. I think that's right. I often say to my students, well, when I was younger, I said to my students, I know that half my beliefs are wrong. I just don't know which ones. Now,
that I'm much older say, I know that a third of my beliefs are wrong. I just don't know which ones, because I've already changed so many of my beliefs that turned out to be wrong. It might still be half. I don't know how to count beliefs, but yeah, I mean, I think we have to. So one thing, so the post-structuralists and social constructionists, without a conception of truth, how can anybody ever be wrong? I think one of the virtues of critical realism is, they're so phobic, these other views are so phobic about truth as being totalizing. Well, I don't think it's truth, the concept of truth that's totalizing. It's your humility, the level of your epistemic humility about truth. So it's because we believe that there's a truth that we can believe that we might be wrong about the truth, and open to discussing the matter with people who disagree with us. Was it Katie? Did I answer the question?
I think you agreed with the statement. So yeah.
Okay.
The next we had and Casey said yes. So we've got Aya saying, can you expand a bit more about the relation between causality and meaning from a critical realist perspective?
Yeah. It's sometimes said that there's a hermeneutic moment in critical realism, and I would say, yeah, it's probably more than a moment. So one of the things is, once you've changed your conception of causality, so there's no longer a law, this kind of if-then laws, but some kind of causal power in things, then, as Roy says, I believe in the possibility of naturalism, and most of us agree wholeheartedly with, reasons to become causes. So that, if you say, well, why are you seeing me now? Well, because I made an arrangement to be here and give this presentation and take your questions, and those reasons were what caused me to be here. They're not law-like. It could be counteracted. I was really afraid I was going to get the time wrong. And then I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to log on correctly. So there are things that can counteract it, but there's still causes. But I want to say something maybe deeper about the question. So now I'm a sociologist, but I'm in the Department of Communication. So I spend a lot of time examining arguments and rhetoric. And meanings, if you think about persuasion is all about how the meanings of things affect us in various ways, whether it's emotionally, it's logically, and how they affect our overall thinking. So it's similar with discourses as a whole. If you look at like Foucault, people who follow Foucault, they want to say that discourses have an effect on people. Well, what you're saying is the meanings of those discourses, either as a whole or in part, are having causal effects on the subjects who are inscribed by those discourses. So, I mean, I think there are many ways in which meanings have causal effects. Once you broaden what we mean by causality, and it doesn't become quite as rigid, causality becomes a thicker notion that not all causality is not the same. The positive is, if you just have an if-then notion of causality relating events, it's very homogeneous. But if you take a critical realist point of view, pushing is different from pulling, and persuading somebody emotionally or logically all become different forms of causal mechanisms.
That's great. And actually, there's another question that continues on causality. So could you elaborate more on historical narratives and how we employ them in case studies for causal explanation?
So actually, I think I say in my book that you were kind enough to mention, that if the paradigm of a causal explanation for positivism is a law, probably a full explanation, the paradigm of a full explanation for critical realism would be a narrative. Why do I say that? Well, because in the open world, what Roy would have called the open world outside the laboratory, the open causal system outside the laboratory, in any real event, you've got multiple mechanisms operating both simultaneously and over time. And somehow you have to pull together this causal conjunctures, as we call them, in a coherent way. And the coherent way that is done is not by a law or even a set of simultaneous equations. It's going to be a narrative. And this is true not just in the social realm, it's true in physics. If you want to explain how the Earth came to be, you got to tell a story that begins with the Big Bang, with the formation of galaxies and supernovas exploding and the sun coming up, forming out of an exploded star, and planets form and evolution. I'm telling you a story. I'm already telling you a story. And so it's not just in the social sciences that I think the preeminence of narrative is true, but in the physical sciences too. I guess just to encapsulate what I'm saying. So the question was, how do narratives function? I think they're the way we give the fullest explanation of real things in the real world outside the laboratory.
Thanks. That's fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to go off the chat now because Ananya has had her hand up for a while. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Thanks, Rob. I had a question earlier which you actually answered. It was on the commitment to truth. But I have another question which is not directly related to your slides as such. But I wanted to understand the difference or the distinction between critical realism and critical theory. To my mind, they're not the same thing, but I hear people use them interchangeably and confusing them sometimes. So I just want to understand that better.
Okay. So I'm going to give you, all right, for somebody my age, critical theory would have meant the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, all the way up through Habermas. Since then, it's taken on a wider range. So in cultural studies, it would take on all kinds of maybe post-structuralist points of view. So today, critical theory would be encompassing from the Frankfurt School up through any kinds of theory which are involved in various ways with ideology critique. Whereas critical realism is certainly hospitable to ideology critique and critical theory in that sense. It's more of an underlying philosophy or meta theory that, and I would say, since you began with a question about truth, that I think critique presupposes truth. That if you say something is wrong, you're saying it's really wrong, not just wrong in my head. It's not just, it doesn't just offend my tastes. It's something that's in an objective sense wrong, whether we're talking about racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever. A critique implies something ontologically objective, it seems to me. So I would say, again, critical realism is at a different, more fundamental level than critical theory. It's more of a philosophical, at the level of philosophical presupposition to and compatible with critical theory in the narrow sense.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I've got a question here, which I wonder if, Doug, you might want to answer, but Priscilla may want to jump in on this one as well. I don't know if you've already seen it, but the question is, what is your gut feeling about the relationship between critical realism and the idea of powerful knowledge? Priscilla's immediately got stuff to say on this, I'm sure.
Well, I'm going to let Priscilla go because I'm not sure what powerful knowledge means.
All right. Powerful knowledge is an idea that's propagated particularly by Michael Young from our Institute of Education. And his idea is that powerful knowledge is the physics theorems, the predictable, reliable theories. They are powerful. And that we should teach them to all children, however bored they may be, give them all a chance because this is equality. But we should reject children coming to school with their common everyday knowledge because that's not powerful knowledge. They're not at school to discuss that. They're at school to learn about powerful knowledge. And also Michael Young did refer to Roy Basker, and he calls his work realism in a critical realist tradition. But I've written 2 papers about the great difference between critical realism and the concept of powerful knowledge. And one of them is an open access paper in the London Review of Education. So if you're interested, you could look up my name and it'll be on, you could Google it.
So this is the first I'm hearing about this term powerful knowledge. So, well, I would say I do think that natural science knowledge should be taught to students along with social science knowledge. I mean, I think all they should be exposed to everything. I do take issue with this denigration of folk wisdom. I think in the social sciences particularly, it's de rigueur to overturn folk wisdom. So, to say that people don't have free will, people, they don't have unitary selves. I mean, we kind of delight in saying the most confrontational things vis-a-vis the folk. And I think in a lot of cases, the folk are actually right. I mean, that's what I take as Roy's description of critical realism as enlightened common sense. That in some ways, we're defending common sense against high social theory. And I don't think actually that the natural scientists get everything right either. I think I can go into it, but there are cases where I think they, when they overreach and try to make pronouncements, let's say on the basis of quantum mechanics about the whole world, when they try to say everything is quantum, reduce everything to quantum processes, I think that they go astray. So
yes, and also Douglas, I don't know where you are of and whether this is the same in the States, but in UK, education, academia is very much divided between pedagogy and the people who are expert in what children ought to be taught. How children learn and how they are taught, and curriculum, in which the experts decide what the children should be taught. And I think it's very sad to split really the structure and agency almost and the culture of education, because how children learn is so integral to what they're learning and their difficulties with learning it or not, that to see impersonal curriculum laid down by the experts on one hand and the other ones, how can we, what are the techniques of teaching? Both of them can become very impersonal. And I think schools certainly in Britain need completely rethinking from the point of view of children being the agents of learning. And they are from the very start as babies. They're brilliant learners. They learn more in their first 4 years than they'll probably learn ever again in their lives. And nearly all of it is self-taught, especially in the first year when nobody can explain to a baby, these are your hands, this is time and space, this is cause and effect. Babies work it out. And the idea that when they start school, you don't build on what they know what they care about and what they're very skillful and clever in, but you just ignore it and set it aside, seems to me, well, I won't use any words to describe it.
Well, I would say I agree with you. I've always been a proponent of active learning, first of all. And again, coming from a communications department now, I always try to tell people, you got to know your audience, which would include children, and where they are, what their interests are, what do they know, what they don't know, and build on that. If you ignore that, I don't exactly know what we're doing here in the States, but I know it's not proving so good.
Yeah, I think actually this is a question that runs on from this runs through from this discussion quite well, which is, can you elaborate more what you meant by saying that critical realism is humanistic or links to or linked to humanism? I think probably sit with the humanistic.
So there's a lot of talk now about anti-humanism, and what humanism means, and I think so I think what humanism meant was against positivist, reductivist views that would say, everything that we think of as humanly important, our moral decision making, let's just say, that so the writer Kurt Vonnegut in The Breakfast of Champions, which is one of my favorite books by him, in that book he affects that everybody is just everyone is just a walking test tube filled with chemicals, and that we have either good chemicals or bad chemicals, and our bad chemicals make us do bad things, and our good chemicals make us do things. That's a very reductive, anti-humanistic treatment of what humans are. So I think a humanistic treatment would be one that values and defends, I would say, some of our folk understanding of what human beings are, which is that our emotions matter, we make choices for which we're responsible. We are responsible agents. I think that a number of theoretical approaches that want to deliver us from bad ideologies and bad conceptual schemes run roughshod, and I think that's a valuable thing to do, but they run roughshod over the individual and reduce us to passive beings who have fragmented selves that are in no position to do anything of a moral nature or to be morally responsible. So the relationship, I think of Sartre, who declared existentialism a humanism, over and against both reductionism and the emerging structuralism of Levi-Strauss, and then Althusser, who Althusser famously declared Marxism an anti-humanism and kind of decomposed human beings into subject positions. So I would say the humanist position, my own view of it, is again a pre-academic view of humans, of what the pre-academic human being would value about humans. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. I wonder if you could say, I mean, maybe if you'd want to say something about how that relates to how religion relates to that, religion, spirituality relate to that, because I think perhaps that the word maybe sets up a dichotomy which I don't think is necessarily there in a multivalent world.
A dichotomy between
religion and humanism.
Oh. Okay, well, I don't know how well known this is, but like Maggie Archer, I'm actually a fairly left-wing Catholic. So I am religious. I would say many things. I feel about the Catholic Church the way I feel about America. Like, that's where I am. It doesn't mean I like it very much. So I would say humanist. I mean, sometimes humanism is meant by that is meant a humanistic approach to people that's moral without religious baggage or religious ontology or metaphysics. I would say better that than the kind of Christianity I see in the United States now. That's like openly racist and homophobic and really not very Christian from my point of view. So no, I don't see it. I don't see a dichotomy between humanism. I could say religions, many religions and religious postures. Religion often descends into tribalism. That's the dark side of religion, that it becomes tribalist. And that's anti-humanistic. Whereas, the ethical humanists, we have in Philadelphia, where I live, we have the Society of Ethical Humanists, well known. Well, they're more humanistic than the religious people. So I think to me, what's important is how you treat people. And if your religion's not getting you there, you're better off being an atheist. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that does. Sorry for putting you on the spot. It just occurred to me that sometimes they're set as at odds to one another, which I don't think they are, and I think you've explained that very well. So I think we're sort of coming to the end of the questions here. So there were a couple of things. Priscilla, is there anything you'd like to add before we might move on to? There are a couple of things that Priscilla and I were going to cover from earlier on in the course. Go over again.
No, just to say thanks so much, Doug. I've realised I've got one or two things wrong about your 7 commitments, and I'm so glad you set me right.
Oh. Is the way I have it right better? Or?
Yeah, I just find them so valuable, and I think they're such a lovely positive list to show to people, saying what does critical realism contribute.
Well, actually, you helped me articulate that I had these 7 commitments. I hadn't thought of them there, and so I appreciate that. And I really appreciated coming here and talking to everybody and hearing the questions.
And also, by the way, to remind people that in your book, there's a table showing the 7 commitments and about 13 different kinds of sociology, social science, aren't there, with ticks as to which ones fit the commitment. And I just think that's fascinating. And sometimes I show your table as a slide in teaching sessions, and really useful.
I appreciate it. All right, thanks, Priscilla. Thank you all. Rob, thanks everybody.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. That was great.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
So that was fantastic, and thanks everyone for all their questions. There's just a couple of questions coming through, which was one was the name of Doug's book, which is Reconstructing Sociology. And in fact, it's the only one of his books that has critical realism in the title, so you'll easily find it. And I'm just looking through. There's just one question or point from Aya that I just wanted to address, which was on that humanism and human-centric. So you've said, isn't humanism more human-centric and religious ideologies more divine-centric, where causes, meaning, and values generate from the same source? And I think I would say on the surface, I'd agree with that, but I'd also say that from the perspective of meta-reality, which is the sort of latter development of critical realism, then we might perceive the self to be divine as well, and part of a coherent divinity in itself. I don't know, Priscilla, is that a reasonable thing to say, do you think?
Some people would say so, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I think anyway, as you say, we're going off track here. But so Priscilla and I were going to talk briefly now, I think probably just for about 5-10 minutes, about retroduction and concrete utopias. So and then we'll have a bit more of a discussion after that, and then maybe go into breakout rooms.
And also we're going to have a PowerPoint from one of the people attending the the group as well.
That's right. Yes,
Yeah.
we'll go straight onto that at the end of this. It's in the same
Yeah.
PowerPoint. So
Yeah.
here we go.
We wanted to draw together retroduction ideas about that, because we've sort of scattered saying things about it, and I've realized I think it's more important than I thought. So my slide is a bit about the history. So from Aristotle onwards, for centuries, people were really instructed to accept received wisdom and what the masters taught, such as Aristotle in the 5th century. And he taught that objects fall because of their weight, their gravitas. But then around the 16th century, people began to be more critical and questioning again, and to think about empirical observations. And the two great methods for doing this were induction, which Francis Bacon wrote about. And the idea is that you observe facts and then form hypotheses. So you start with lots and lots of facts, and then you move up to the theory. And with the falling objects, you would observe and measure and count and so on, lots and lots of falling objects, and think about the general theory. Yes, maybe they do fall because of their weight. Now, the opposite, which is more fashionable today, is deduction, which Aristotle used, which is to start with your theory and then test it with empirical observations of lots of data. And that moves from the general theory to the particular falling objects, from the universal to all the individuals, see if they fit. Now, this, both induction and deduction rely on evidence-based. But if we're going to think about causes, we also need to use our imagination, because many causes are invisible to the naked eye, such as the virus, for example, or the cancer tumor. There has to be a leap of imagination. Now, retrodiction is looking at all your knowledge and information so far and thinking, do we need to look at it in a different way to come up with a different theory? And with this, it's we have to think about, why do they fall? Is it really the power and energy inside the objects that makes them fall? Now, the retroduction is this leap of imagination, which is based on the question, what must the world be like for objects to fall? And the what question is about ontology, really examining existence, but with imagination to look beyond it to the cause and ask not only how, but why. And as we know, Isaac Newton came up with this stupendous idea of gravity, which can never be seen, never be proved, and yet it seems again and again to fit everything from, I've written, from the murmurations of starlings to the multitudes of stars. Gravity, like truth, is sort of behind everything. It was just an amazing thing for Newton to consider and for scientists to accept, because it doesn't seem very scientific in some ways, does it? Stupendous, unimaginable, unprovable. And yet so many thinking about the causes, the unseen causes, has that link. Another is William Harvey, in the days when you couldn't have much vivisection, to realize that the pulse around our body, it comes from the heartbeat, and the heart works like a pump. So that leap of imagination to connect the physical heart to a mechanical pump and see the similarities. So retroduction is this leap. Now on to Rob.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Priscilla. So I think this this fits quite well with what Doug was saying around intellectual honesty. And Drake, to give you another acronym for critical realism, but this one I hope will be useful to you. This is where retroduction fits into a schema for scientific discovery, or as Pascal calls it, the Drake model of scientific discovery and development. So this is the pattern that you might follow to within your research. I would suggest you ought to always follow within your research. So the first is the description of patterns or phenomena, as with any form of as we saw before. Each of the different types of sort of scientific endeavor that we were doing, there were description of patterns. But then we have the retroduction. So this is, again, refers to the imagining of possible mechanisms that might account for the phenomenon or pattern. So this is, the key is imagining the possible mechanisms. Again, important, and this is where we start to get into our intellectual honesty, elimination of those mechanisms that do not apply. So we're not just throwing out any possible imagined mechanism, but we're eliminating those that can't be possible, and they may be eliminated by further observation, they may be eliminated by experimentation, but we will continue with our intellectual honesty to question those mechanisms that we've developed. And by eliminating those ones that can't apply, we can then identify, and this is what Pascal refers to, the causally efficacious generative mechanism or structures at work. And then finally, and continuing in this vein of intellectual honesty, always being prepared to correction of findings in light of this identification. So we keep going back, and in fact, a sort of to maintain your scientific endeavor, your intellectual honesty, you ought to arguably constantly be cycling through this Drake model, going through these different stages to keep testing and questioning the theories that you've come up with and the generative mechanisms that you've proposed. So that's Drake, and this relates to, as we've talked to before, and I think Priscilla, you spoke about this last week, to the holy trinity of critical realism. And not just holy because holy as in religious, but holy due to absences, as we discussed before. So ontological realism, apologies, that's completely wrong. Ontological realism is vital if we are to accept intransitive problems and remedies such as for global heating. Epistemological relativism accepts that our understanding is limited, fallible, partial, socially produced, and transitive. Real independent ontology cannot be collapsed into our fallible human perceptions. And finally, judgmental rationality recognizes our ability to adjudicate between ontology, epistemology, and morality in order to criticize the present and progress towards new futures. And I liked as well, just to go back to what Doug was saying, how he referred to a few times how to critique presupposes truth. So that gives us a foundation for our investigations. And I'm going to move on now. We said as well that we would, I think someone asked us if we would talk about concrete utopias. So this is a really important concept within critical realism, the concrete utopia. And they're concrete because they are well-rounded and fit for purpose. Abstract utopias, which are often criticized, are dismissed as unrealistic or unhelpful. And so again, concrete utopias are grounded in a critical realist understanding of reality or the self. So to give you an understanding of that, I'm going to give you an example. When we talk about abstract utopias, we might be talking about something like a sort of a fictionalized future, something like the Jetsons, where we imagine this perfect society. And that probably is unrealistic because it would be very difficult to imagine ourselves to the point where we achieve that utopia. But the concrete utopia is grounded in specific actions, concrete actions that we can take based on theory to make the world better, to improve the world. So I'm going to give you just a very, very, very specific example here. So these two pictures show two streets in the same city, the same day at the same time. And the street that doesn't have any trees in it, you can see by measuring the temperatures on different surfaces, is considerably hotter than the street that has got trees growing up it. So the trees, we know from our understanding of trees, of nature, and the world, we know that trees will will provide shade. They'll also provide the transpiration from the leaves of the trees helps to reduce the temperature further. And added to which, the trees sequester carbon, which helps to reduce the impact of global warming. So while we can see that there are still cars driving around the road, down the road, there are still problems with this city. It's not perfect, but there is a concrete action that has been taken to improve the area. And that action could be repeated in other streets by knowing that this works, establishing that this works. This is a concrete example of a utopian solution to a problem that we face in the world. So that's an example of a concrete utopia. And this perhaps thinking about your own research, that this is really what you're aiming towards, is that's coming up with small concrete steps that can be taken to improve the world. So I'm going to move on now to Priscilla's going to talk now, do a presentation from one of the other students who's not able to be here today about their work. So I'll hand back to you, Priscilla.
Thank you. I'm going to very briefly present Notbund Matvicic's, I'm sorry about my pronunciation, slides, because she is in Bangkok and it's easier if I present it. I put her email there because anyone who is looking at air pollution, climate change, and other themes of critical realism may well want to contact her. And also she sent very useful notes to me and a lot of background. And this is an advanced study and it's so valuable. It's a pity, really, we haven't got half an hour to look at it properly. So it's also about future studies, and it continues what Rob has just been talking about. It's not about accurate predictions of the future, but rather systematic study of possible, probable, and preferable futures. And in Thailand, Thailand has one of the 10 worst cities in the world for smog and air pollution. And this is the topic of the research. To propose critical realist theories as decolonial frameworks through the case study of air pollution. And so I'll just quickly read it out, that conventional futures studies based on external experts-based reports don't reflect the complexity of social transitions. And critical realism's generative mechanisms make explicit the structural and cultural barriers, highlighting their temporal and historical power, which are the main constraints on social change. And creating awareness of these causal mechanisms to social transition is the fundamental step to decolonizing the future of air pollution in Thailand. So now there are two very, very packed, oh, sorry, can I have the next slide, please, Rob? They're very dense and very packed. But the iceberg model is very important about what you see. In the second slide, you see events and what's happening. What patterns do you observe? Patterns of behavior. What's causing the patterns being observed? Systems and structures, echoing what Doug's been talking about. And what are the values, beliefs, and mental models that frame and enable the problems, the mental models? So, and again, those interests may well want to contact NOC because of all the details of this very important slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, again, there's a great deal of detail here about identifying what the problems are. And the worry is that there's a lack of accurate information to the public. And the government has an interest in suppressing this information. And so number 2 describes the source of the suppression. It's the outdated standards, the government's interest, the hidden truth, and the constitution that lets the Prime Minister decide. It's so important to look underneath at where the power is, isn't it? And number 3, criticize the sources of oppression. So although Thailand hasn't been a colony, Nook thinks that there is a colonial attitude that is pervading the politics, and that regulations have tilted power to the government with unequal power, and the citizens have little alternative but to conform. The government doesn't have to explain why it rejects the bill that the citizens proposed. This discourages people from participating in transformative change. They have low perceptions of individual power in creating change. So number 4, advocating actions that remove these sources, a bit like Rob's trees, update and strictly comply with World Health Organization standards to provide a clean environment for the citizens. The citizens have the right of access to pollution standards and reports and should be informed about health risks. Air polluters should be held accountable for pollution emissions and subject to penalty, really bringing in economics inevitably, and reframe the air pollution issue to one of the basic human rights, the right to breathe clean air. But then moving, step 2 is really about emancipation theory, a critique to correct misunderstandings and false beliefs. A free and equal society should not be concealed from the truth that represents its citizens, thereby removing unwanted determinations in a progression towards emancipation, as Basker and Collier have said. Next slide, please. And then Nock draws on Margaret Archer's work, which Doug referred to, of structure, culture, and agency all interacting, examining in great detail how the different parts are interacting, and then looking at the morphogenesis, the 3 progressive progressions forward of morphogenesis, movement forward, or morphostasis, things being stopped and locked. And step 4, morphogenesis theory, looking at structural and cultural conditions that predate human interaction within society. But there's an independence between agency and structure. And ideally, people have power to resist or deny structural and cultural tendencies. But in practice, the presumed power is minimized, suspended, modified, or redirected by the pre-existing social norms. And that is such a valuable paragraph for everybody thinking about utopian research, researching change and steps of change over time. Now, I do hope that at some point or other, Nock is going to publish this work and let us know. And while I remember, you may know about the Critical Realism Network, which is a very active and useful information base. I've just had 2 messages from it today. It's not all that it's not all that busy. It's really worth having, and we're going to send you the link to it in our final email, I hope, aren't we, Rob? And also, anyone who wants to report work that arose or was discussed on this group, if it's published or anything like that, it would be so great if we could keep in touch through that very useful network.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Priscilla. We've got a few questions coming in, which I think are probably relevant enough to answer them before we.
Actually, Rob, I was wondering, since there aren't that many of us, whether it's just worth carrying on.
Yeah, I think so, and we'll run out of time if we go into breakout rooms. So let's just carry on the discussion. We'll run out of time if we go into breakout rooms. So if we just carry on the discussion now, then. So I'll just speak to a couple of questions that have popped up here. So Varney said, in a PhD thesis, how much attention would you expect to see on the E, so that was the elimination, and the C, the correction of Drake? I think you'll probably find that you're expected. Well, I think you'll find that you naturally will end up doing them. I sort of see where the question's coming from, because I think as you see that me talking through that acronym, you're probably thinking, oh Lord, how much more work is this going to produce for me? But actually, it's just good practice, and I don't think you you may not be using the specific acronym, but I think it's quite a helpful thing to be considering when you're doing your research, that you always ought to be you always ought to be thinking about how you can correct your theories. And in fact, I think you would you'd struggle to pass your Viva if you haven't given due attention to questioning what your theories. Priscilla, would you agree with that?
Mm.
Yeah, I think you would need to do that anyway. Then we've got from Caroline. Do you have any recommended reading for the transition between the leap of imagination to the more real part, when we have been able to systematize that, what we came up with, the leap of imagination? So, well, maybe you'd like to say something here, Priscilla, but just initially, I think the point of the imagination is that it's not systematized. It is a leap. So I think it isn't systematized. I think so I suppose the only thing that I would say to this is that that imagination, the ideas tend not to be born. It goes back to when I was talking about meta-reality. Ideas tend not to be born out of conscious work. They come from moments of unthought, of unthinking. So if you're struggling, then go out for a walk. Stop, move away from your desk. Would be my only advice on that. But Karen, you've got your hand up. Do you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you so much, Rob. What I was trying to say here is so exactly that, we have this leap of imagination. We then come up with these kind of causal pathways, or our hypotheses. And then, so my question is there any formal reading really, where this transition from my leap of imagination, I come up with this, and then I need to systematize and use theory and, do all the kind of work, as you said, the work I have to do. I'm just kind of trying to find sources to read, maybe, that I can then use and justify, because so many people, when I talk about this process, then the thing that they come up with is that critical realism, in that retroduction or in that moment of creating these causal pathways, that one is too much in our heads, or we imagine a lot of what is the possible theory or what is the possible concept, and that we're less anchored, so to say, in the reality of the participants, if you wish. So I wonder, is there any reading where I can say, okay, here it is? That was my question.
I can't. So, well, there's two answers to that question. One is, I don't think you're going to get. In short answer, I don't think that. I can't think of any reading that answers exactly what you're saying, other than in Enlightened Common Sense, which is Roy Basker's final book, is quite good on Drake. Yeah, exactly, as Priscilla's holding up. And I think this is where the application of Drake comes in, that it becomes grounded by elimination, that E of Drake, that you come up with these ideas, and then you eliminate anything that doesn't fit your data. So you are using your data, but you're using your data to eliminate rather than that. But I do see what you're saying, and I can see that argument. I think it comes from, perhaps the response is a robust application of Drake in this instance. The other one, which doesn't really answer your question, but it just occurred to me, there's a very good pamphlet. It's really obscure, this. I'll try and find it for the last email that goes out. But there's a pamphlet that's written by someone who works in advertising in the 1960s, who talks about where ideas come from, and he talks about the need to not work on ideas. He's essentially describing meta-reality without calling it such. But I'll try and dig that out as well. But I think really it's just the application of Drake. Priscilla, would you like to add anything to that?
No.
No.
Just to say, I think this is probably a very underwritten about subject generally, isn't it? And maybe if you look at work on Newton, Darwin, Einstein, these great thinkers, there might be very interesting reflections on there.
Well,
Maybe
Archimedes is the classic one with Eureka.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a mathematician, so I do believe in the leaps of imagination. They do really bring you very, very much forward. And they are always, these eureka moments are leaps of imagination. The point is, go back to reality and then justify that in a way that the imagination then becomes the truth. And I think in that process is where people, where they kind of, they build an argument against some things in critical realism. But thank you so much. It's very useful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's as you. I mean, it sounds like you've thought it through pretty well. But yeah, that's going to be a standard attack that you've just made it up then. But then you have to be prepared to explain how you've eliminated things that can't be possible. Aya, you've got your hand up.
Hi, sorry. I just wanted to expand on this because I was actually having the same problem with using how to use actually reductive reasoning. And what I'm doing right now, and please tell me if I'm doing it right or wrong, that I've just came back from the data collection, and I have a lot of transcriptions to do. So while I'm doing the transcriptions, I'm actually putting on explanations of my own, and they are like, I'm not like looking in literature or not looking for theories or anything right now. I'm just putting on why I think is happening or the causes behind this, or why these people are saying these things. So I'm not really filtering any biases or not filtering any positionality in this case. And I'm kind of writing this down all over it. Like my intention is later on, when I start doing the more deep analysis, I'll start trying to work with all these intuitions and reflections and instant reflections with every transcriptions, and see where are, for example, the patterns where things have kind of repeated, where things didn't repeat. Try to validate this with document analysis, with literature analysis, with even statistical analysis from my surveys. So I don't know if this is kind of a right way to do retroduction, but I want to, if this is right, please let me know. Thank you.
So I'm just trying to get. So the question is I mean, yes. I mean, I think what you've described is going back to the question of the point with retroduction is what must the world be like for these to be the case. So you did talk just now about looking for sort of constant conjunctions of events, I think is what you were describing in patterns and things like that, and those are important, but those are not necessary, if that makes sense. But yes, so they're important but not necessary. So it may be that it may be that if you're looking at, it sounds like you're looking at quite a large data set, you may find phenomena that are not generalized, which I think is important to appreciate. So you're bringing in all those options. Priscilla, do you want to add anything to that?
Not to that, but I've just seen another question on the chat. Could I answer to? And that
yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Have you got any ideas how you carry on after the course? Somebody said, you're now on the lower rungs of the critical realism ladder. I hope you feel secure on your first rungs. And our aim really is to get you confident there. So then you can tackle things like, well, certainly Doug's book, Reconstructing Sociology, is just such a clear outline. I hope my 2021 Critical Realism for Health and Illness Research is another that will sort of give you some companionship and help you up the further rungs so that you can study a bit more independently and confidently. That's really the aim of this course, wasn't it, Rob?
Yes, and I mean, for me personally, because I'm very much a novice. I mean, I did the course a few years ago. I think for me, what the course offered when I did it a few years ago was that as well. You know, having done the course and having the dictionary of critical realism sitting on my desk, I was then able to engage with, you know, with the Journal of Critical Realism and engage with critical realist books that had been, quite frankly, been Greek to me before doing the course. So I think hopefully you've got some of the tools to be able to start engaging with critical realism more generally. Yes, did you want to say something?
Yes, there's two small comments here on the methodology and research discussion here. In the book of Denmark, 2019, he have 5 stages of explanatory research based on critical realism, where he actually puts the retrospective part after the introduction. And those 5 steps might answer the question from Caroline there, where actually how to actually investigate the relationships after you have made the introduction. That could be helpful, and he also has a discussion on the methodology, how to proceed and make the research. I found that very helpful for me, at least. So,
sorry, where was that?
Denmark, the 2019 Explaining Societies. I can.
Do you have? If you've got the reference, do you want to put it in the chat?
They have it. Yes.
Great.
Yes, and the other point is actually, could anybody have interest in the same group, maybe meet once a month in the future, discussing a paper, discussing a method, just to continue keeping up the good work. I know the class ends here, but on a more self-organizing structure, actually continue that. If anybody's interested, I would like to, to arrange it and set up the meetings, but putting in content on the regular basis is huge work, but I thought that could maybe be a self-organizing idea, and maybe invite somebody if anybody have the relations to do that.
That would be lovely. And maybe you would like to, I don't think we've got a list, have we? An email list, have we? Oh yes, you have, haven't you, Rob?
Yeah, I think the best, I think that's a great idea. And I think that would be, because actually, well, Priscilla and I have talked about, you know, what this looks like going forward. And I think is, you know, Priscilla, perhaps we could do that next term. We could just have the occasional meeting before sort of launching into the next course next year.
The other thing I was going to say was that the Critical Realism Network I've mentioned already has got a list of about 5 different specialist e-groups for critical realism, which again we might send you. But for a group to arise out of this course would be a lovely idea. I hadn't thought about that. So
yeah, well, if you'd like to, do you want to drop me an email? Because just very quickly, I think one way of doing this would be perhaps to set up another Eventbrite, and then if I can link that on my final email to the whole group, and then people that want to join in, you know, can.
That was my idea, yes, and then people could join in and see if they want to continue, and then actually just we'll present the next time. We can discuss that. I will drop your mail on that.
Brilliant. Yeah, good idea. Thank you. Sorry, Caroline or Caroline, we've got your hand up again.
Yeah, just sorry to interrupt. I was saying that the Critical Realist Network, I'm part of those reading groups, and they are really helpful. I'm on the education list, so I'm happy in the Critical Realist Network. I think there are the contacts. If you want me to send you an email with that, I'm happy to because it is very helpful. And I think, you know, I'm not an expert. I did my PhD using critical realism, and I did it all by myself because my supervisor trusted me, but he didn't know anything about it. So I learned, I would say, very much independently. And I think these groups and what you're doing here is incredibly useful to just give us this, you know, we're on the right track, and then you can just go by yourself and investigate deeper. So the groups are very helpful.
Yes, it would be great, I think, to continue.
Fantastic. That sounds great. Yeah. So if you drop me an email, that'd be fantastic.
I will do.
And thanks very much, you, for putting that link in there. That's really helpful.
And someone has mentioned the Denmark book in the chat as well, which is again a very, very useful introduction.
Yeah, brilliant. So does anyone have anything else to add? We're sort of coming to the end here, but it's thankfully for Uf's intervention, it's probably not the final one, so we will meet up again, I'm sure. But is there anything anyone else would like to add before we do wrap up? No, I don't think so. Priscilla, is there anything
Yeah,
like
there are two hands.
Oh, well, Caroline's hand, is your hand still next to me? All right, and I think Vina was just waving.
Oh, right. Okay.
I was just saying clapping. Thank you very much. You've done a brilliant job. And I think, we really appreciate how much, time, energy and effort's gone in. So I just want to say thank you so much because I, really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. And it's such an extra pleasure to talk to people all around the world. It's it feels lovely.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for all of your contributions. I think we've had a particularly vibrant group with people chipping in with questions, and we've not often had silences, which can often happen on these Zoom calls. So thank you very much for everyone for engaging so well, and thank you, Priscilla, because actually all of the planning and the legwork and the structure of this has come from Priscilla and the expertise. So Priscilla, thank you so much for this round of reading groups, but also Priscilla, thank you for historically keeping the reading group alive, because it would have, after Roy sadly passed away, then it would have disappeared without you. So thank you very much, Priscilla, for keeping it going for all this time, and for all of your work on this.
Well, thank you, Rob, because without all your support and practical knowledge and technology and so on, whatever you say, it would have been impossible without that. So,
well, no problem. It's been
and also
a pleasure.
to thank everybody who's contributed on the chat and asking questions, and some of you presenting PowerPoints. It would be lovely to have had more time to involve more people, and also in the breakout rooms as well, all the sharing that's been going on. So
brilliant. So I'm going to